All right, welcome to the Unit 5 class. I will get your exams back to you, I hope Wednesday. I thought I would have them graded, but the conference that I had in Georgia was busy, so I didn't get much schoolwork done. We have a very special guest today. He's Stephen Greenwald is the author of the textbook, This Business of Film. He's also what is your exact title? Associate Dean, or what is it? Your exact title is Dean, Director of Film and Media Initiatives at Wagner, with terminology that administrators know, but yeah. And one of his jobs here is, or I guess your main job here is to develop and innovate new program at Wagner College so that we can do more with film and media and the business and administration of that. So I'm going to do the thing that we usually do. I'm going to introduce the class, the text, and then I'm going to stop and I'm going to put some questions on the page. Gina, could you turn off the light just for the front? Good, thanks. So I'm going to do the thing that we usually do, put the questions up, and then I'm going to stop and invite Stephen to talk to you guys, and you can ask him questions, and we'll just take it from there. So let me go to the PowerPoint deal. So Stephen, basically what happens, I press a button, and now whatever's on the screen is what is being recorded. So we're talking about new kinds of forms of production, and I'll put this PowerPoint on Moodle like I always do. And of course, the assigned reading and viewing was the Engaging Cinema, the chapters on ideology and race, the globalization on ideologies of globalization, business of film, and then you had to read a few pages from Rhizomatic West, and I'm guessing that if you guys got that far in the reading, you found the Rhizomatic West really hard. So we'll go over that at the end. And then also the movie Once Upon a Time in the West by Sergio Leone. And I think one of you, I forget who it was, asked me about 3 or 4 weeks ago what my favorite movies were. Was that you, or was that, I can't remember who asked me. And I think the answer that I gave you was The Third Man. It's a good movie, right? It's a good movie. So that's one of my favorite movies of all time, and I encourage you to watch it. And maybe next time I teach this class, I'll teach it. I forgot how relevant it is to the topic of globalization, but one of my other favorite movies of all time is Once Upon a Time in the West. So I've been showing movies that I appreciate from a teaching standpoint. Citizen Kane is an important movie. North by Northwest is useful for teaching editing techniques. Panama Deception is a documentary that I think teaches globalization well. The Searchers is an important Western historically, and other people like it. I personally don't. But Once Upon a Time in the West is actually a movie I love. Okay, so some of the concepts that we're doing this week. So when you're working on your essays, these are some of the concepts you can use. Ideology, hegemony, culture, race, ethnicity, rhizome, and transnational. And just to kind of, I hope you're getting a sense from the reading and from my class that some of these words are words you've never seen before, like rhizome and hegemony. Some of the words are words you have seen before, like culture and race and ethnicity. But I'm asking you to look at them in a new way. I know you think you know what race and culture are. You've probably heard use the word culture a million times, but I'd like you to consider that maybe you don't understand the word culture the way I do. So that's what I want you to think about. So some of the big questions for this unit, and we've already talked about this a little bit. We talked about this last week when we started looking at these things. Is the Western genre an American genre or a global genre? And then the next question is the Western, I mean just the subject, just what happens in the film. Is the Western about a national culture, a shifting border culture, a hybrid multi-ethnic culture, a transnational culture? Of course, now we have to figure out what any of those things are, right? Or is the Western really about, is the place where there is no culture? It's like the anti-nation or the anti-culture place. So then shifting to the subjects that Stephen Greenwald has written about and also that we started talking about last week, is the film business national, multinational, transnational, or is there something else about the film business that's special that we're not getting at, that we need to figure out? How is the content and style of film influenced by the business of film? But I also want to go the other direction because I think it works both ways. How is the business influenced by the content and the style? So those are some of the big questions for you guys. Just quickly, hegemony. How many of you has anybody experienced this term in class, in another class? What class? In World Lit? Okay. What did it mean there? Right. Okay, yeah, that's a really good example. So the English school system, hold on, I think Tentpole is actually logged on. Let me just go back. Let me just interrupt and I'll repeat what you said. Tentpole, are you there? All right, I don't know. He's trying. Okay, we'll go. We'll just keep going. So yeah, so what you just said. Oh, he's there. Oh, good. So I will stop. Well, I'll just go over what you just said. So basically, just so it's recorded because they can't hear your voice. But yeah, so when you have like a colonizing culture, like the English in Africa or the English in America, they set up their own school system. It's their own language, their own way of government. And this kind of hegemony is not just political, right? It's not just the government. It's also the education system, the newspapers, like every aspect of the culture, even the language that they use. So what else? You had your hand up, or what? Okay. Right. So hegemony is the dominant culture. Here's an important part. Here's one important thing to think about hegemony. That so basically what you guys said is half of it, and it's really important half of it. The other thing to know about hegemony, though, is that it's not that the culture is imposed. Okay, so the dominant culture is not. It's not like some king or some guy comes along and just says, "Here's what you have to do," and everybody does it, and they're forced to do it. It's everybody in the culture buys into it. Okay, so there's motivation, and this is what we call like the manufacture of consent. Everybody's participating in their own domination. Okay, so then we need to like think when we're thinking about how ideology works. The two models are binary opposition model or web of social relations model. So the binary opposition tends to be an us versus them, good guys versus bad guys, and the web of social relations tends to be a more diffuse, complex kind of way of looking at relations where it's not just us against them. So I'm going to stop for a second and talk to Tentpole. Tentpole, can you hear me? Are you there?
Yeah.
Hey, how are you doing?
Hello, doctor.
Good morning or good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
Uh-oh. This thing is off. You turned your mic off.
Hello.
Hi, Tentpole. Can you hear me? I think he's having technical problems. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. I'm going to introduce.
I'm
going to introduce Stephen Greenwald in a moment. So, yeah.
I'm going to introduce Stephen Greenwald in a moment. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Your voice is somehow interrupted now.
What?
Your voice is interrupted.
Yeah, I think there's a connection problem because there's a delay.
Oh, yeah, I think there's a connection problem. The delay. Okay.
Does somebody let Adriana in? Okay. Let me put this up for a second.
Okay. Let me put this up for a second. Okay.
Okay, we've done this. So we've done this. We've done the assigned reading. These are the questions.
We've done that.
There's a real delay.
We've done the assigned
like that before, wasn't it?
reading. These are the questions.
And now I'm going to introduce Stephen Greenwald. So these are some of the points that Stephen Greenwald's textbook talked about, like studios and multinational conglomerates.
Stephen Greenwald's textbook talked about studios and multinational conglomerates.
So Walt Disney and ABC are one company. NBC and Universal and General Electric are one company. General Electric makes a lot of the equipment for fighter planes and other military stuff, as well as light bulbs. We have the issue of finance. We have the possibility of censorship. But these are some of the questions that I have in the new kind of global economy where investors are all over the place. What does that mean for film? And Walmart is already censoring film, by the way, and music. Fox is just doing Fox's thing. So I don't know if I'd call that censorship. I'd just call that Fox. But Walmart actually actively does censor content. So then the question is, what's going on? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce
Good morning.
So then the question is, what's going on? So
this is a new experience for me, so I have to get accustomed to it. But I'm happy to be here this morning, both here and there. And I thank Steve for inviting me this morning to talk to you. I think this class is fascinating to me, both in terms of the content of the class and also this amazing attribute of having the class here and in Ethiopia at the same time. I did want to, since you mentioned the third man, I wanted to just tell you a quick story about that. I was involved with a company some time ago that owned that film, owned the Third Man film. It was a company called Thorny MI, a British company. And I agree with Professor Thomas. I think it's one of the really great movies, and certainly you should look at it. It's also what I think is close to a perfect film. No film is perfect, but I think it's close to perfect. And one day I arrived at the office of this company in London, and the fellow who was running the company for us over there said to me, "Well, we may have a legal problem." I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, there's somebody here in the UK who's claiming that we gave him the right to do a remake of The Third Man." I said, "Well, why is he claiming that?" And he said, "Well, we had some discussions at one time about giving him the remake rights, but nothing ever came of it, and there's really no agreement and so forth, but he's claiming that we had an agreement." And so I said, "Well, let me ask you first, why would you give anyone the right to remake Third Man? It's like giving somebody the right to rewrite War and Peace, something like that. I mean, all that a remake can do, in my opinion, would be to, reduce the value of the original." And then I found out that the producer who he was dealing with was someone who made mostly horror films, low-budget horror films. So that was even worse. Anyway, we put an end to that, and but it does raise this issue of remakes and sequels and so forth, which has very much become the business model, if you will, in a certain way in the industry now. Also, I just wanted to comment about Once Upon a Time in the West. I agree again with Professor Thomas that this is an amazing film in many ways, and if you've seen Django Unchained, I don't know how many of you might have seen that. In many ways, it's an homage to Leone's films, including Once Upon a Time in the West. There's also another film that he made, which I would recommend. It's called Once Upon a Time in America, which very much in the same style, that deals with the rise of a group of actually Jewish gangsters in New York in the 1920s and the 1930s, and covers a period of about 40 years, and it's also an epic. New York. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Well, that's probably true. Those kinds of deals are made. I worked with a producer named Dino De Laurentiis, who came from Italy originally. And Dino made about 700 movies in his lifetime. He produced 700 movies, which is as much as some studios produce. But he owned the rights to a science fiction book, actually a series of books called Dune. And he wanted David Lynch to be the direct Dune. This is sort of the reverse of the story, which is true. And David said, well, I'll direct Dune for you if I have this script I wrote. It's a story I would like to do. It's called Blue Velvet. And I'll only do Dune for you if you do Blue Velvet, if you promise me that you'll finance Blue Velvet. Now, have you ever seen Blue Velvet? Okay, with Dennis Hopper, and it's also quite an amazing movie and a very strange movie, one that Dino would never understand. But in any event, so Dino said okay, and he made Dune, which at the time, by the way, was the most expensive film ever made. Cost about $45 million. It was made mostly in Mexico, which talking about the internationalization of the movie industry. And it wasn't successful financially. Has anyone seen Dune? Yeah, which version? Because there's a couple of different versions. The version that David turned in, the so-called director's cut, which is the end, the cut that the director finishes and then turns over to the producer, is about almost 4 hours long. And the studio was Universal, and here we get the business versus art, which is one of the themes I wanted to talk about today, because film is very much a combination of art and business, and I'll come back to that because I think it's critical to answering some of the questions that have been raised. Universal was the distributor of the film, and the idea of putting a 4-hour film out into the theaters was not something they liked. Why? For one very simple reason that we can all probably intuit. What's wrong with a 4-hour movie as opposed to a 2-hour movie from a business point of view? Well, does the consumer pay any more to see a 4-hour movie than a 2-hour movie? So what's the problem with it? Exactly. You can only show it half the number of times. They can show a 2-hour movie. So they, in America, the golden rule is that he who has the gold rules, and business generally dominates the art. So the film was cut to about 2 hours and made it completely incomprehensible. Even if you read the Dune books, you couldn't really figure out what was going on. About 5 years ago, the full-length version, the director's cut, was re-released or released. I think it's still incomprehensible, but on the other hand, I'm not a student of Dune, the series Dune. So then we made Blue Velvet, which Dino really had no idea what Blue Velvet was about. It's a very weird movie, but it got 3 Academy Award nominations. So when Dino was interviewed, he was a great character, one of the great of a dying breed, you know, sort of moguls. And he was interviewed, and his story changed. And he said, well, after these Academy Award nominations, he said, well, when I asked David to direct Dune, but I told him, David, I will only let you direct Dune if you let me make Blue Velvet. So he flipped the story completely. And anyway, I do recommend you see Blue Velvet. So, oh, cheaper. Yeah, Blue Velvet cost about $6 million. Well, we made a few dollars on it. It wasn't a huge hit because it was a bizarre movie. But it's become a classic. It has become sort of a classic film of its genre, and it led to a couple of television series that was very popular for a while. It wasn't called Blue Velvet, but it had a similar kind of theme. Small town America, weird things going on in small town America. Twin Peaks. Thank you. Twin Peaks. So, coming back to some of the main themes that Professor Thomas asked me to talk about. And I started to talk about the fact that film is both a business and an art form. Throughout the history of the industry to today, there has been that dynamic of art versus commerce or art versus business has been critical to the growth of the film industry, the direction the film industry has taken, the kinds of movies that get made, and so forth. And we'll come back to that and explore that a little bit further. One of the reasons, now you could say that, you know, many art forms are also businesses. In other words, we can talk about music, which is also a business. We can talk about even the world of visual art, which is also to some extent a business. But I think it's more pronounced, this dichotomy, not dichotomy, the dichotomy and the fusion is more pronounced in the film industry for a very simple reason, or at least one simple reason, and that is that film is a very expensive. You know, if you want to write a novel and you can pay the rent and feed yourself, you know, you can close yourself up in your home or your apartment for a year or two and write a novel and then get it published, hopefully. If you want to record music, you can make a demo tape for relatively, you know, little money, and you can try to get a record deal or get yourself booked into performing venues and so forth. It's very hard, though, to make a film without a certain amount of capital. And film is also a collaborative medium, meaning that one person can't make a film. You need a whole group of people to make even a relatively simple film. You go, for example, and see some of a short film or a documentary or a short documentary, and you see the credits attached to it. You see how many people are involved, even in making a film that's even not a feature-length film, but a shorter film. So film demands a lot of resources, particularly a film that will play, you know, that will attract audiences. So film has always required a lot of capital, a lot more capital, and because of that, filmmakers have been forced, if you will, into collaboration with business and with financial sources. And as I said, in the United States, the business side has always dominated the artistic side. Now, the reverse is true outside of the United States. It was true outside of the United States, I should say. If we go back to the beginnings of film, film in the U.S. began as a business. The film industry in the United States was started by people in the retail business, who opened theaters. They were called Nickelodeons at that time because they cost 5 cents to see the movie. The interest of the owners of the theaters was to sell the film, if you will, to audiences. A lot of the audience was made up of recent immigrants who had come to America, and they learned a lot about the country by watching movies. So the business side dominated from the very beginning in America. Those retail merchants who opened those original theaters became the producers and distributors, and that was the beginning of what became the American film industry. In Europe and in other parts of the world, developed differently, particularly in Europe. And film began around the same time in Europe, but in Europe and in other parts of the world, film was seen more as an art form like other art forms, and was subsidized by governments, by the public sector, just as other art forms were subsidized by the public sector in most countries around the world other than the United States. And therefore, the commercial imperatives that existed in the United States, meaning that the films had to work commercially, they had to make a return for the investors, wasn't the same imperative that applied, outside of the United States. In countries in Europe where the funding for film came from usually government agencies, the money tended to go to directors and filmmakers whose work was valued by the decision makers in the government who made the decisions about who was going to get money and so forth to make their movie. So had great directors, for example, come out of Europe, people like Ingmar Bergman, Francois Truffaut, Sergio Leone, although he was more of a commercial filmmaker, Federico Fellini. Some of these names you may know or not know, but they were some of the best film directors in the world, and their films are some of the best films in the world, but they generally were not that commercially successful. But it didn't make any difference because they were evaluated on different criteria, which was the criteria of artistic merit, and therefore they continued to get money from the governments. Jean-Luc Godard, who was a famous French director, is famous for having said once, well, I don't care if anyone ever comes to see my movies. If nobody shows up to see my movies, it doesn't bother me. I make my movies for myself. And so many of his movies were not successful financially, but he kept getting money from the French government to make more films. That would never happen in the United States. If a director's work is not commercial in the United States, doesn't generate revenue, then he or she is not going to get more financing. So it's a very different model. Now, some people would say, and I would tend to agree, that it's precisely because of that different model that American films came to dominate the world film market. One of the things you asked me to talk about was is film an international business? Yes, it's very much an international business. But it's an international business that up until quite recently has been totally dominated by American film. Now that's changing to some extent, but until recently, if you looked at box office statistics, for example, in countries outside the United States, say in Europe, for example, you would see that American films made much more money than local films. That's changed recently, especially in France and a couple of other countries. Which? Oh, Titanic, yes. Oh.
In Europe, for example, you would see that.
Right. Now, why are American films so popular? Anybody have an idea? Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. And why are they made to appeal to a wide audience? To make money, exactly. And people who can make movies that appeal to a wide audience, directors who can, filmmakers who can, will get more money to make more movies. Those who can't make movies or don't make movies that make money will not get more money to make movies. So America, the American system has a built-in bias in favor of filmmakers who know how to make commercial product that will have a broad appeal. Again, that's not necessarily true in the other parts of the world. But there's some additional reasons, I think, why the American market has been dominant. And we can think of it, I want to bring it back to, or link it to another point I wanted to make about, is film international, is it national, is it transnational, which Steve talked about. There are many local film industries, meaning that there are many countries make films, or films are made in many countries. Most countries have some type of filmmaking that's going on. But in order to have a vibrant film industry, what I would call a commercial film industry, there's certain minimum criteria that you have to have, certain things that have to exist. I think there are three that I talk about in the book. The first is demographic. You need to have a certain size domestic market. And why? Because you can't assume that your film is going to appeal to people outside your domestic market, because the movies usually deal with issues that are local in nature. The American market is big enough and has always been big enough to make it feasible to have substantial budgets for films which translate into production values that make films appealing to broad audiences, and could be successful even if the film doesn't work on an international scale. That's not true of other countries, even European countries, for example. The population of France is about 80 million. The population of Germany is about 80 million, and so forth. And because the domestic markets are so much smaller than the American domestic market, they can't spend the same amount of money on films that we can here in the United States. Now, money, I'm not equating money and quality, don't get me wrong, but money does enable you to, as I say, put certain amount of production value on the screen, to make movies that are action-oriented, for example, with a lot of special effects, and to enhance the visual dimension of the film, which makes a film more exportable, makes a film more popular on an international basis, because the story is driven less by dialogue and more by the visuals. So that's one reason I think the American market is dominated. Now, but it also, the corollary of that is that you have to have a certain critical mass of the population in order to have a viable film industry. That's a good. Well, to go to the movies, yes. Yes. Well, that's a good point, and that adds to my point, right, that you need a domestic market that's big enough and large enough and also economically capable of supporting an industry. That's one thing you need. The second thing you need is a capital market. You need a developed financial market, a capital market that can support and invest in film, because film is expensive to make, particularly commercial film. And third, you need democratic system with a certain amount of freedom of the for the arts, and not, non-democratic systems that will perceive film as being primarily vehicles for propaganda or for propagating a particular ideology. And if we look at the history of film in countries like China, like the Soviet Union, like the Eastern European countries, for example, you had some wonderful filmmakers, but there was an ideology that was imposed on the film industry. Certain topics could be dealt with, others couldn't. Certain messages had to be sent through film, and film became propaganda vehicles rather than entertainment vehicles. Also, there were limits on the subjects that could be covered. There was censorship in a very significant way. We've had our censorship issues in America, but not of the same type or sort. So you need those three ingredients. You need a sufficient critical mass of population and an economy that would support leisure activities like going to the movies. You need a capital markets that can support the making of film, which is expensive. The average studio movie, and studio I mean Warner's, Sony, Disney, today costs about $75 or $80 million to make a movie. A film that just came out this weekend, Jack and the Beanstalk, which looks like it's a flop, cost $190 million to make. So it's expensive, and you need a lot of money to play in the movie industry, to be an effective player. Yes. Okay. Okay. So by capital markets, I mean you need a source of investment, private investment, not government investment. And in America, by the way, government has played a very limited role in financing films, as opposed to, for example, in Europe, where, as I mentioned earlier, films were basically paid for and subsidized by governments. So you need investors who will invest in the business. Now, there's two ways to invest in films. One is to invest directly in a film. Somebody has an idea for a film, and they go out and they try to raise money from us, let's say this class, to make that movie. And we need to have the disposable capital if we want to take the risk of investing in a movie to do that. The second are the so-called capital markets, which are Wall Street, the financial sector, which aggregates capital from many investors and then invests in films two ways. One, by buying stock in or lending money to the film companies, the studios, Warner's, Universal, which, by the way, now is owned by Comcast. General Electric sold. Yeah, that's one of the places my book is out of date. That's why I'm working on the second edition. Things change quickly. So by either buying stock in those companies or investing to buy stock. Huh? Comcast is a big cable company. Yeah, they own. No. There is no effective antitrust law in the United States anymore. Antitrust law has been totally gutted in the last 20 years, since Reagan, since the Reagan administration. So, well, that's my point of view as a lawyer also. But so you invest either directly in those companies or you lend money to those companies. But that requires, as I say, capital markets. And there are a lot of countries in the world that still don't have effective capital markets. Also, film is a high-risk investment to some extent, riskier than some other investments, and therefore it demands a higher return, whether it's in terms of interest on loans or in terms of the valuation of companies and so forth. I don't want to go too far into that because that gets complicated. So with those conditions, then you have the basis for a film industry. And I think, as I said, the American industry, I think, is dominated for a number of reasons. First of all, because commerce always trumps art in America, and that's better from a business point of view and better from an international point of view. We make movies that have a very broad appeal, as you said. Secondly, we had a large enough domestic market that enabled us to make movies that had a lot of production values without the necessity of having to sell those movies outside of America. So that just became gravy, if you will, or extra sources of revenue. Third, we have the First Amendment, which does cover film. Film is a protected enterprise in America under the First Amendment, freedom of speech. Therefore, the government is not allowed to and is not permitted to censor films. Whatever censorship there is in film, when you see the ratings, for example, now, that's self-imposed censorship by the industry. It's not imposed by the government. In America, the Supreme Court has held that film is protected by the First Amendment, so the government can't interfere with the content of the film. So we have all these ingredients in America. As a result of all this, also, American writers became adept at and skilled at the art form of writing scripts. Now, script writing is very different than other kinds of writing, or it's different, I should say, than other kinds of writing, than novel writing, for example, or short story writing, or stage writing. It's a particular form of its own. And American writers mastered that form a long time ago. To some extent, British writers also are good at script writing. And now more and more countries are developing their own film industries, so writers are coming from other countries as well. But that was another reason that the American market really dominated the world market. So is film international? Absolutely. And what I just said, all of what I said is changing to some extent. So in countries like France and Germany now, for example, local films, domestic films are earning as much as American films, or even more to some extent. And there are reasons for that, which I have, if I have time, I'll circle back to, or I'll come back to. But it's still essentially an American business to a great extent, in commercial terms, not in artistic terms, but in commercial terms. And also, if you think about film as an export, film, by the way, entertainment generally, meaning film, music, publications, and so forth, is the #1 export industry in the United States. It used to be aircraft. Aircraft used to be the #1 export industry in terms of sales abroad and money coming back into America. But for about 15 years now, entertainment, led by by movies and television programs, is the #1 export industry in the United States. So that's a significant factor, I think. Yeah, #2 is finance. Right. Media, and you could, video games, music, books, film, television programming, and so forth. Now also, the average studio film today, over 50% of the revenue comes from outside the United States. So over half of the revenue is coming from outside the U.S. So those are some factors. Now, the question about the impact of film, this dichotomy between film and art that is inherent in the industry, how has that been impacted by? How has one dimension of that affected the other dimension? How has the business side affected the art side? Well, very significantly. But there's before I answer that, there's another element to film as an art form that differentiates it to some extent from other art forms. Can anyone tell me what it is? If you read those few pages of my book, you would know what I'm getting at. What is it about film as an art form that's different than, let's say, painting or writing? It's collaborative, but I'm getting at it different. Anybody think of it? Okay. Well, I won't keep you in suspense. It's Film is a technologically driven art form, very technologically driven. Film didn't exist as an art form until the necessary technology was created, right? People have been drawing on the caves, on the walls of caves, you know, for 5,000 years, maybe 20,000 years. People have been writing in one form or another for thousands of years. People have been dancing for thousands of people who have been making music for thousands of years, but there was no such thing as film until what was invented? A camera, film itself, a projection system. So from the very beginning, film required at its base certain technology. And what has happened historically is that as technology changed and improved and expanded, that affected the kinds of films that were made and the nature of the films that were made. The most obvious change was what? What was one transition that took place in the 1920s that all of you, some of you, or all of you should know, even if you've never studied film? Sound, exactly. Sound, which in the late 1920s became, you know, a reality for film. Well, just think about it. How did sound change? Sound changed not only the way films were made, now there was sound, but it changed in a profound way the kinds of movies that were made. Because now you could have dialogue-driven stories, and you could tell stories that differently, in a different way, and different kinds of stories than you could tell without sound, which depended almost entirely on the visual. So that technological change drastically changed the kinds of films that were made. Another example, the advent of television. Okay, television, which really became a commercial business in the late 1940s, completely upended the film industry. Because for the first time ever, there was competition for the so-called, for the eyeballs of the American public. You know, more people went to the movies in the 1930s. In pure numbers of people who go to the movies, more people went to the movies in the 1930s than go to the movies now. Okay? Why? And one of the reasons is obvious. Why did more people go to the movies? What? Yeah. Right. There was, yeah, you saw two movies, you saw newsreels, you saw a serial, you saw all of that. But beyond that, there was no other competition. If you wanted to see audio-visual entertainment, your only choice was a movie. There was no television. There was no internet. There was no other way to experience an audio-visual artwork. Okay, it was only film. So yeah, well, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and film, by the way, has always been a very inexpensive art form from a consumer point of view. It still is, although we all complain about how much movies cost today. Over in Manhattan, it's $13 and $13.50 now is the standard price. But you know what the standard price is for a Broadway ticket, for a ticket on a Broadway show? It's up to about $140, $150 for a ticket to a Broadway show. So film has always been a cheap bait, as they say, where it's always been a relatively inexpensive entertainment modality. And it's always the first date. So in any event, after the advent of television, however, in the late 1940s, which grew very rapidly, by the late 1950s, 60 million American homes had television, 60 or 70 million. For the first time, the film industry was faced with competition for the eyeballs, so to speak, of the American public. Well, that put the film industry into a total panic. That's a whole story in and of itself, which we don't have time to get into. But one of the consequences of that was that the industry understood that in order to convince people now to leave their homes, to go, and this happened, by the way, simultaneously with the expansion of the suburbs, to get in their car and drive somewhere to a movie theater or go to a movie theater, pay the babysitter, et cetera, they had to see something they couldn't see on television, and that led to two types of film product that was different than what had been done before. One was epic type films like the Ten Commandments and very Cleopatra, big movies that were spectacles in a certain way. The Bridge on the River Kwai and so forth, with a scope and a depth and a scope that couldn't be replicated on television, certainly not at that time. The other dimension was to go into topics and subjects that couldn't be covered on television, such as sex and violence of nature, strong depictions of violence or sexual content. And we see in the 1950s with the growth of the independent sector, films that dealt much more frankly with sexual topics and with violence and so forth, because those kinds of films could not be replicated on television. Now that's changed too with the advent of what kind of television? Yes, but all as no, that's a good example. Well, I'd say that has changed itself with the change with an advance in television that began to take place in the 1980s and the 1990s. Can anyone think of what that is? Right. Cable television. Right. And especially pay cable television. Because the FCC, which controls, the television, unlike film, is not protected to the same extent by the First Amendment. Television can be regulated by the government because it comes into the home. And the FCC has always limited fairly stringently what can be shown on what's called over-the-air broadcast television, which is basically channels 1 to 13. But with the advent of cable television, and particularly pay cable, where you had a choice, so the viewer had a choice of either buying it or the service or not, they relaxed the rules on what kind of content you could have. So today we have many shows on cable television that match or equal film in terms of sexual content, violence, language, and so forth. But that wasn't the case until quite recently. So that's another example. I'll give you another example of how industry. Okay. We on? Still on? Okay. Of how the business side and business affects the content of films. In the beginning of the 1990s, the film studios all became parts of large media conglomerates. They were no longer standalone film studios, companies in and of themselves. So a company like Columbia, for example, was acquired by Sony, which is basically an electronics company. Universal was acquired by General Electric, which is in many different businesses. Warner's was acquired by Time, which is a publishing company and a television company that they own cable television systems and HBO and so forth. Yes, right, that started in the 1980s. Yeah, right. Yes, and that's what I alluded to earlier. Now, so these companies, these film companies, were no longer standalone or independent businesses. They were parts of these conglomerates, and they were relatively small parts of these conglomerates. And the main concern of the people who ran the conglomerates was the share price of the stock of the parent company, and they were not risk takers. They had no interest in taking risks. If you go back to the heyday of the studios, the Warner Brothers, the Louis B. Mayers, MGM, companies like that, they were to a certain extent risk takers. They were playing with their own money, although a lot of it was investor money. But their concern was not so much over the price of their stock. They were competitive in the marketplace, and they would take risks on films. They would, be somewhat adventurous and take chances in the kind of content they made, the kind of films they made. But once the conglomerate era took over, the principal interest of the people who ran the conglomerates was the share price of the stock, and they didn't want to take any significant risks. So what do we see as the dominant motif, if you will, or dominant style of film over the last 15 or 20 years since conglomerates have taken over? What kind of films do we see dominating the screens now? We see so-called tentpole films, which are films that spawn sequels, like Pirates of the Caribbean or Iron Man. Yeah, sequels. In other words, this worked before, let's do another one. We see adaptations from comic books. We see adaptations from amusement park, rides. And we see a focus on what market, predominantly? The youth market, the young market. Film people from 15 to 25, basically, are the major market. Yeah. Right. So we see. No, but that's the market that the films today, the studio films are aimed at. Now there is an independent sector, but the films from the studios take about 90% of the box office in the United States, and there's very little money in actuality. In reality, there's very little money left over for the independent film sector. Now we've seen another change via technology, or other changes because of technology. The most recent change has been computer-generated images, so-called CGI, the digitalization of film from 2 points of view, one production and the other distribution. But if we talk about it in terms of production, how does that manifest itself in movies today? If you've seen movies like Avatar or, the typical widely distributed movie today, well, take Life of Pi. How many of you saw Life of Pi? Anybody see Life of Pi? Okay. It's a great film. I think it's a terrific film. But of course, about 80% of that film was made how? It was made on a computer. It's computer-generated images. The tiger was not real. The tiger was a computer-generated image. And almost all of the action that took place during most of the film, when he was out on the water, was computer-generated. And you only had one actor during all that time, and that was the young boy. But it's a good movie. But because of the growth of CGI, that enables filmmakers to be much more adventurous, if you will, or more imaginative in terms of special effects. And we saw it in movies like Avatar and Life of Pi and so forth. So movies, and CGI is expensive, but it's less expensive than other kinds of special effects used to be, the way of creating special effects. It's also less expensive than having to put expensive actors in your movies. And CGI machines don't get residuals. Whatever you spend on the CGI, that's it. Actors get residuals, actors have pieces of the action, and so forth and so on. So there's been this shift more and more to films that are made on computers.
if your predominant mode is
Yeah.
So if your dominant mode of production is writers, directors, actors, and stuff like that, then the film production has to be local, or it doesn't have to be, but like a big part of it local. When the major part of the filmmaking becomes CGI, then you can have people in South Korea or some other country do it. Does that make sense? So like I think.
Well, it is. A lot of it is done outside the United States.
I think a lot of the new Star Wars movies and a lot of the new stuff that you see, even remakes of old films, are most of the technology is done in some other countries.
Yeah, a lot of it's being done in Asia, Southeast Asia. Here's another change that as a technological change, but it also has financial implications, business implications, and it's changed the nature and the kinds of films that get made. So that's one of the points I wanted to make, that both technology and the business imperatives have changed not just the way films are made, but also the kinds of films that get made. And there's fewer and fewer independent films that are being made that are more dialogue-driven, that are not dependent heavily on special effects or CGI or whatever. And they're being made, but they have a limited market. But now there's another shift that's taking place, of course, and that is the shift in distribution. Because we have a very interesting phenomenon going on. If you go back to the beginning of film, the turn of the 20th century, people watched films first on what were called kinescopes. A kinescope was a machine that you looked into. You paid a nickel or you paid a dime or whatever, and you could see a movie. You know, did any of you ever have as kids what they called it, where you would look in, I forget there was a name for that. It was like a pair of binoculars, but you could see right. It was something like that. I can't remember what it was called, but and it was slides. Basically, it was slides. So in the earliest days of movies were watched on small screens. Then business grew and it expanded to larger screens. What phenomenon is going on now? IMAX, no. Well, IMAX is, No, I'm thinking we're coming back to smaller screens again, right? People are watching films on that or on their iPad, right? Or on their phones. So there's been this, it's actually, I think, a fascinating, phenomenon. And more people are watching, especially young people, are watching films that way. Now, if that continues to grow as the modality, if you will, of watching movies, what is that going to mean? It's going to change the kinds of movies that get made. For example, I think it will increase and improve the viability from a commercial point of view of short films. Films that are 15, 20 minutes long, which now have no commercial life in America. Yeah, because people's attention spans and their capability of watching, if they're not in a theater somewhere or even at home, is limited. They want to watch a story that they can watch while they're on the train or while they're on the subway or on the bus or whatever. 15, 20 minutes tell me a story. So it's going to lead, I think, to a renaissance of short films. And it will change film in other ways that we can't conceive of now. Now, the other interesting development, because of all the new platforms that exist, like Netflix and YouTube to some extent, but Hulu, Netflix, Amazon now, who are getting into the business actually of making movies themselves. Netflix is now, they just came out with a new television series called House of Cards, and they're beginning to act like HBO. Remember, in the very beginning of HBO, all HBO did was license and show movies that were made by the film studios. They only started making original content back in the late 1980s and in the 1990s because it got too expensive for them to buy movies from the studios. So they began to say, let's make our own films, which is now the major part of their business. We're seeing the same thing happen with companies like Netflix and Amazon. They're beginning to make their own movies. Now, I have a prediction on that from my own experience, and that is that most of those experiments are going to fail, because making movies is a very different business than distributing movies. And there's lots of examples, and I lived through some of them myself, of companies that were distributors of films and decided to become makers and producers of film. And it's a very different business, so I'm skeptical myself about how well that will work. But it is beginning to develop. And when I was out, I recently was at Sundance, which is one of the big film festivals and markets in the U.S. And all the talk was about how there's been a revival in low-budget movies. Revival in terms of private investors wanting to invest in smaller movies, like $2 million, $3 million. I mean, that's a lot of money, but in the movie business, that's nothing, or very little. And why? Not because those films can get into the theaters, because they generally can't get into the theaters, but the sense now is with all these new platforms that are available, with all this so-called Internet Protocol television, video on demand primarily, and other similar formats where people can buy movies in many different ways, that you can actually make it a profitable business even if you never get into a theater with your film. So that's bringing about some revival of lower budget films. And they're generally what's called genre films, meaning they're horror movies or certain kinds of comedies, or zombie movies, or whatever you want to call it, but aimed at particular markets, and particularly markets of people, made up of people who are technologically savvy and are living, now with all this technology and very comfortably with it. So we see, again, technology and business changing what kinds of films will be made.
So we see again.
Sure.
One of the changes also that what you're talking about has led to is it has opened the American market, because your generation gets stuff on the internet a lot of the time now. This has opened the American market to new markets like Indian Bollywood films. How many of you watch Bollywood movies? And I actually predict that in the future, Americans are going to start watching Nollywood movies. Nollywood is Nigeria. And because you're bored,
I can.
Television does not allow the new platform encourage that, and then that creates.
Yeah, and that works both ways, by the way. In terms of the exporting of American films, or think about film as compared to other kinds of export industries, particularly today. Film is very simple to distribute all over the world. I mean, theoretically, or not even theoretically, we could make a movie, this class, let's say we made a film, and we could distribute that film literally or throughout the world with the click of a mouse, right? With a click of a mouse, we could send that film out all over the world on a particular platform that people would be able to access. We don't have to ship a can of film, celluloid film over to another country. We don't have to get it booked into a theater. We don't have to get it licensed to a local broadcaster for television. We don't have to sell video cassettes, right? Or we don't have to do, that's what you had to do before. That was the only way you could distribute film. And even then, film and television were the #1 export industry, okay? And compare it to other potential types of export industries like automobiles or airplanes, which require enormous costs for distribution, enormous costs. Now, the capability is there to distribute a movie for nothing. This will also increase, in my opinion, the value of what are called film libraries. Film libraries, because of film, the other interesting aspect of film is that it's intellectual property. And intellectual property is, the way intellectual property is monetized is you never sell it. You license it for a short period of time to a broadcaster or to a theater or to a video company or to an online distributor. And then when it comes back to you, you license it again, right? And you license it all over the world. So you build up a library. The studios have library, thousands of films that they own the rights to that can be re-released every time there's a change in technology. Think about music. How many of us have CDs? Well, you're not old enough. So we have CDs, and we also have vinyl records of the same performances by Elvis Presley, for example, or Nat King Cole. Elvis Presley, you'll know. Nat King Cole, you won't know. But my point is that with technology, there's also an opportunity every time the technology changes to redistribute and re-release this intellectual property. And now it can be done instantaneously and for very little money. So this is going to change, totally change, I think, the nature of the film industry. Again, as it's changed many times.
So Ethiopia has struggled to develop film industry for three reasons. One, the three reasons that you just mentioned. They didn't have a capital market. They didn't have a government that allowed for innovation. But now that's changing in Ethiopia. Ethiopia now does have a public sector. It's starting to have capital markets. What is all this change in technology?
Well, I think yeah. Well, first of all, there's another aspect to the change in technology that I didn't touch on, and that does directly impact what you're asking me about, and that is that the cost of making films has gone down. If you take out of the equation talent costs and so forth, the actual physical cost of making films has gone down because of new digital equipment. So today, you can shoot a film on digital cameras and so forth, and edit it on a computer. So whereas in the past you had to have special editing equipment that was extraordinarily expensive, and camera equipment and so forth that was extraordinarily expensive. So there's been this democratization of film, if you will, of filmmaking, because the cost has come down. So number one, Steve, it will be less expensive for people in countries like Ethiopia to start making films. Now, if the cost of films goes down, that means they can sell it for less. In other words, they can offer pricing of the film in the markets there for something that's more compatible with the economics of that particular market. Now, there's still this question: can they go outside their market? Will these films travel internationally? That's a much more difficult question to answer. Let me say something. At the end of the day, what is film about, or any art form about? It's telling a story. Okay, it's storytelling. If you don't have a good story to tell, it doesn't matter, to some extent, how technologically savvy you are, or how brilliant you are in terms of manipulation of images and so forth. Yeah, and the film will flop, right? So people want to see a good story. Now, the problem with countries, these developing countries, or indeed countries outside America, this goes back to one of my very early points. American filmmakers, because the commercial imperative was always dominant, became very adept at telling stories cinematically. In other countries, they didn't learn that craft as well. The writers didn't learn the craft as well, and stories tended to be much more parochial. So, for example, Australia, where I had some experience in Australia, I actually set up a film company there, and we built a film studio, which is still the largest film studio there. And there were some wonderful filmmakers in Australia. Bruce Beresford and Jane Campion and many great directors, and some wonderful films were made, but they tended to be stories about local issues. And they didn't tend to be the fantasy kind of films that sell around the world that Americans made. So even though they were good films from an artistic point of view, they didn't have commercial potential. And so for a country like Ethiopia, I think the challenge is to figure out how to tell stories cinematically. That requires skill in screenwriting as well as directing. If you have any chance to get your films out, you began to say that those films would be distributed internationally. Now the good news is, coming back to what I said a few minutes ago, now potentially someone in Ethiopia can make a movie and can distribute it out over these platforms, these IP internet platforms, again with the click of a mouse. So that there's a capability for distribution instantaneously in many countries or around the world that didn't exist before. But how do you get people? Now there's a couple of dimensions and problems to that. Number one, how do you get people to pay for that? Because if you don't get people to pay, if you give it to them for free, then you're not going to be able to sustain yourself as a business. And to get people to pay for it requires not only telling good stories, it also requires marketing. The American industry spends an enormous amount on marketing. I said to you before that the average cost of a studio movie today is about $75 million. That's just to make the movie. To distribute it, to market it, to run the ads for it that you see on television and so forth, they spend about another $60 million. Almost the cost of the film itself. Studies have been done that show that most people go to a film because they've seen ads for it on television, which is an expensive way to advertise your movie. So the question is, the challenge is to figure out ways to market your film so that people will pay you for it. If you let them watch it for free, they may watch it, they may not watch it. But it's hard to sustain an industry by giving away your product for nothing. So these are all interesting challenges that are out there, and but it also means there are great opportunities, which is what I always tell people: with challenges come opportunities. And whoever figures out how to monetize or how to make a profit from these new systems and these new models and platforms will end up doing very well. So again, technology is changing the industry, and it's further internationalizing the industry. And I would say film is among the most international of businesses because it's something that appeals to people worldwide as a means of telling stories. Film and drugs, right? So, yeah, questions or yes?
I think we have that it's affected the film industry at all, either artistically or commercially. It seems like a lot of times nowadays it's not part of a franchise or just a Meryl Streep or Tarantino or somebody attached to it.
Well, you mean because of the economic downturn? Yes. Now, the theory always was that film was not subject to the same economic elasticity of other types of products. And during the Depression years, for example, in the 1930s, while there was some downturn in attendance, people still went to the movies because it goes back to what I said before. It was a relatively inexpensive form of entertainment as compared to other entertainment forms. And people especially, and the theory also is that in bad times, people need relief, and relief comes through entertainment. So they like to, go to a movie or watch a movie and be entertained and distracted from what's going on in the outside world. In the last cycle, this current cycle of recession and so forth, there has been, there is one phenomena that we've seen for that goes back even before the recession, is a decline in the number of people going to theaters to see movies. Theater attendance has remained flat or has actually gone down over the last 10 to 12 years in terms of the number of people who go to the movies. And one of the reasons for that, guys like you, younger people seem to be going less to a cinema, to a theater, and relying more on other ways to see movies, downloading them and so forth. So there's been a decline. But the real hit for the industry came from a withdrawal from the market of financial sources for making movies. Because in the last 10 years or so before the recession hit, a lot of private investment money was coming into the movie industry via these hedge funds and private venture capital firms. They discovered, quote unquote, the movie industry as being something, a hot industry. Why, I'm not sure. The last time that happened, I was actually involved in it, and that was during the video boom. In the 1980s, when there was a video boom and the video sales were going up geometrically almost, a lot of new film companies were created, like the one I was involved with and others. Most of those companies went out of business as the video business declined. So a lot of private money starting in the late 90s was coming into the movie industry and supporting the creation of new companies like Relativity Films and Lionsgate and Summit and companies like that. And bolstering the balance sheets of the big companies as well, because they were providing capital for those companies to make more movies. But starting in 2008, when the recession hit, those companies pretty much withdrew from the industry, and the banks particularly pulled out of the industry. And if there were 20 banks that were active in the film industry in 2007, by 2008 or 2009, there were maybe 5 left that were still doing business in the film industry. So that got reflected in less films being made. The studios reduced the number of films that were being made and focused even more on big so-called tentpole movies that they thought could carry the day, and did less experimentation with lower budget independent films and so forth. So that's how it hit.
I just want to, before we go, I wanted to come back to one of the concepts that I use, which is not a concept that people in the business world use, but is a concept that people in the literature departments use, and that's hegemony, right? We talked about hegemony. Now, you both talked about hegemony as this kind of imposition of a kind of dominant culture, which is true. But I think as you've been listening to Stephen talk about how the film industry actually works, with multiple forms of collaboration, with new technologies that challenge the older models, that create alternative structures that people can use. So you can see how an artistic film, like we can go back to the art and business, how an artistic person who may have very radical political ideas has to work with the business community or work with his national government, and may have to work with the business community and national governments in other countries. There's a lot of collaboration, and to think of hegemony as just like one group imposing on another group, or the ruling class imposing on another class, is not an accurate way to think of hegemony. Does that make sense? It's like it's very, very complicated, and there's a lot of different places where new ideas can come in and older ideas stay in power and stuff like that. So I wanted to kind of return to just to kind of show you how complicated the idea of hegemony actually is. And I think your discussion of how the film, just like very basic, just like here's how it actually works, shows you how hegemony actually works.
Yes, it's a very. The film industry is an oligopoly, if you know what that term means. An oligopoly is an industry that's controlled by very few companies. The automobile business is an oligopoly, and the commercial film business, we know it, is an oligopoly. There have been for 50, 60 years now, basically 6 or 7 companies that dominate 90% of the film market, and control 90% of the market. And one of the reasons is the high barrier to entry in the industry. Because unlike other businesses, like you see a company like Groupon, for example, is having all kinds of problems because the price of entry to compete with Groupon is very low. You just need some computer equipment and some programs. The price of entry into a movie industry, competitive, is very high. You need to aggregate a great deal of capital. It's like the movie, it's like the automobile industry. Sorry.
No, okay.